So we're at 5 o'clock.
Awesome.
So we have around almost 100 plus attendees right now. So probably can start.
100 plus. They're all in the wrong room. They didn't want to come see me.
All right. So welcome to the first virtual dreaming session that we're going to have. So today I want to introduce John Daniel. He'll be presenting architectural considerations to implementing Salesforce DX and second generation packaging. If you have any questions during the session, please post them on the Q&A session, and we'll try to address them as we go along. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, folks, you're in the right spot. We're talking about architecture considerations, implementing Salesforce DX and 2GP. If you know me, if you talk to me at all, you know that this is by far and away my most favorite topic in the world of Salesforce DX. So, real quick, just, again, thank you to all these different sponsors. Again, I'm very excited about the virtual dreaming concept, and I know that without these guys, it wouldn't have happened. And of course, you've been seeing all day lots of references to, among other things, Mercy Corp and for the COVID-19. And so, please consider thinking about donating because definitely there's a lot of people out there that need some help. And so, with that, I'm John Daniel, and you can find me on Twitter. This is a little bit about me. I am a Salesforce architect and the platform lead for B3 Group. I am the Salesforce platform lead for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs as well. I'm a Salesforce MVP, certified application and system architect. I am one of the co-leaders for the Richmond, Virginia Developer User Group. I manage a lot of different open source projects out there. Most of them are under the banner now of the Apex Enterprise Patterns Group. We'll go into a little bit about that. I've been the reviewer on several books, Salesforce books, and love doing that. Lots of good stuff out there nowadays. And when I'm not doing Salesforce, I'm all into Jeeps and beach and sailing and, anything with NASA and stuff like that. So, real quick word about the company I work for. It's B3 Group. We are an IT consulting firm based in the Washington, D.C. area. We are a Salesforce partner. We primarily serve the U.S. federal government and with a deep focus in specifically the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. We are a veteran-owned business ourselves where our guiding principles are all about based in servant leadership. And so for more information about what we do, just go out to b3group.inc.com. So just quick high-level agenda. We're going to review a lot of different concepts. We're going to review the happy soup, why it's not good, some thoughts about how we can tackle this issue and rectify it. And we're going to look at some of the benefits of DX and 2GP adoption. We will get into basically a general adoption plan about how to migrate large environments to DX and 2GP. And then we'll talk about how that will change lots of different areas around your environment. So, quick note about some of the terms and concepts out there that I'm talking about. Salesforce DX or SFDX. One of the biggest misconceptions I find when I'm talking about it is people think it's a specific tool. Well, it's not. It's actually an umbrella term over several different features that Salesforce has recently come out with, about the last 3 years or so. We're going to talk about second generation packaging, or 2GP. We'll talk a little bit about continuous integration, CI, and continuous delivery. And just a thought about where my head is with this talk. It's all about the software application architecture and design concerns. And so that's where I'm focusing all my information about. So some people are asking, well, what the heck is John doing with DX and 2GP? So a couple of years ago, I used to work for the Morgan & Morgan law firm, and I led basically the first sustainable implementation of second generation packaging. Later, I went on to become the director of platform architecture at a company called Rootstock. And Rootstock's claim to fame is they are an ERP software vendor, but they also have the largest managed package in the world. And so I worked there to start to transition to DX and 2GP for that. Over the past few years, I have led multiple development teams and helping them transition from the monolithic happy soups to a series of 2GPs and led enterprise transition teams for various clients. and to begin so that they can begin the transition. Again, I have been working with open source code bases, and I think I've migrated all the ones that I have now over to Salesforce DX and 2GP. And currently, I am focused heavily on transitioning the Salesforce applications at the Department of Veterans Affairs. So again, this is what I've been living and breathing for the past 3 years, and I'm excited about it. So let's talk about the happy soup. First of all, it is a term that you find in the community. Basically represents an unpackaged org. That org usually has lots of applications, has a lot of time on it, no clear definable boundaries between these applications. It's all one big org. You often find the logic and the metadata highly intertwined and dependent on things, and that usually leads to a lot of what I call circular references in the metadata. And when I talk about that, it's you might have a visual force page that depends on the controller, that depends on an S object, and that S object has an action override to another visual force page. And so now this first visual force page now has a dependency on the other visual force page. And so there's a lot of areas where you can get circular references and it becomes very untenable. It makes it difficult to pull this chunk out of the org and isolate it. And so this kind of thing really just makes it very tough to work with in an environment. And you often find these environments just overburdened with large amounts of tech debt. Now, why is happy soup not good? Well, as a good friend of mine said, let's first clarify the term. It's really the unhappy soup. It's not happy at all. But it's difficult to understand, when you look at the org, it's difficult to understand how new features and updates will impact current functionality. Because again, when you're looking at it as a very large org, it's difficult to understand, well, what is going to be the impacts and how and where that will come to play. You find in these types of orgs that the tech debt grows so big that the interdependencies get so crazy that you basically start treating that org as one big single unit or a black box. And it makes it very difficult to incorporate new features, new applications, because you're always very worried about not upsetting or disrupting the state of affairs. All too often these teams that are dealing with this type of environment, they are very, very risk averse. They are very averse to any type of change whatsoever. And that makes it very difficult when you've got, especially, team collaboration scenarios. Multiple teams working for an enterprise, trying to do all the different development, and they keep stepping on each other. They keep working on it, and they develop a new feature that inadvertently screws around with the account trigger or some process builder on the contact, and it just inadvertently causes downstream effects in other areas. And so it's just a crazy mess. So, when folks start thinking about implementing DX, it is not something that, you'll simply flip a switch and it'll be on and all is said and done. Very often all these transitions they're going to be difficult or nearly impossible without some level of refactoring. The only time this is not true is when you have a brand new Salesforce org and an experienced team that can do things right from the ground up. There's a concept that I talk about a lot when dealing with this, and it's basically your code base needs to have boundaries if you're going to migrate to DX. Now, there was an interesting comment by a gentleman named Stephen Harrod. Stephen Harrod is a Salesforce CTA, and he lives in Sydney, Australia, and he has global responsibility for the entire Salesforce practice of Accenture technology. So the man has some credibility, some street cred, and he knows what he's talking about. It's kind of interesting. Back in February, he was on the Salesforce Developer Podcast. And it was specifically the episode called The Role of Architects. And by the way, as a plug, if you haven't checked out the Salesforce Developers Podcast, please Google it and love it. It's wonderful, wonderful content coming out from there. But during that talk, Stephen made an interesting comment. He talked about the areas of responsibility in system architecture. And specifically, he made a very interesting statement. He said, it's important to system design to have proper boundaries. And those boundaries really are the understanding of where one thing ends and another thing begins. Now, that may be applications, or it might be the handoff from common services to business functions, whatever that is, it's important to have these types of boundaries in your code. And I find that to be totally true in, among other things, migrating to DX and really to second generation packages. And then finally, Stephen went on to say that this issue about not having clear boundaries is the leading cause, in his experience, to all kinds of confusion and problems in Salesforce environments. So, when you talk about boundaries, especially for 2GP and DX, you're really talking about software application architecture level. And it's critical to get these boundaries in place. You have to know where one application begins and where another one ends. It's important for you to, understand that unless your code base is brand new and well organized, you're going to have to deal with some level of a refactoring exercise. You're going to have to put some work in it. It's going to have to change in order to make this DX adoption focus. And the last thing that I always talk about with folks when they're working in this is they've got to stop thinking of the Salesforce org as a single unit, as org-centric. And more importantly, they need to focus their mindset around it being modular-centric. So we'll get into a little bit more about that. When you're starting this effort, it's always good to look to other technologies for lessons learned out there. Salesforce has been around for 20 years now, but there's been lots of technologies, Java, .NET, Node.js, all these other ones. They have been around a lot longer in some cases, and they've done a lot of the issues that we've seen. And so things like software design patterns can help with this type of effort and help you organize your code base. If you haven't really explored the concept of solid principles in designing your application, I highly implore it. These 5 general principles go a long way into setting up your application so that it can have these proper boundaries and can immediately be moved out into various packages and take advantage of DX. And another concept that I'm heavily a proponent of is dependency injection. Dependency injection allows us to, it's actually part of it's similar to the last principle of solid, but really it's about allowing you to inject certain components without necessarily changing the code base. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But overall, the goal here is just to simply reduce the impact of making changes to your org. So when you start this effort, obviously one of the first things you want to think about is, what is the benefits of migrating? And there's lots of benefits, and I could go, 2 hours talking about benefits alone on this slide, but I'm not going to do that. Mostly because I have dinner in about an hour and a half, and I want to get to that. So anyway, there's definitely DevOps benefits. It's easier to report and test smaller, modular-focused apps. If you're trying to do, say, a code scan report across your entire Salesforce org, especially if that org has any kind of life to it, that code scan report is going to come back and it's going to be huge and it's going to be just riddled with errors. Well, how do you know where or really who should fix these things? If you've got various teams that have areas, responsibilities over sections of your Salesforce org, it's very difficult to say, well, this is an Apex class. Who has responsibility for fixing these types of issues? And having separate work orgs and scratch orgs and package modules, also enables the development teams to concentrate more and worry less about just simply disrupting other people. I mean, how many of those have been out there? Development teams have been in a single sandbox, and they all have been developing, and you've got 2 developers who, one guy saves a change to an Apex class or a visual flow, and another person saves another different change to the same class or flow, and, well, you just screwed up the first guy's work. So that kind of a problem there is corrected when you go to DX and 2GP. There are a lot of deployment benefits, and really the deployment benefits come about because of second-generation packaging, or another way to term it is atomic discrete units that can be versioned. Think about it. Since deployments are based in packages, you don't have any of these issues about merging code as you come in, from lower environments up to, say, tests. Maybe you have 3 or 4 development environments, and you have to find a way to merge that code into, say, the common Apex trigger. And so there are ways and techniques to avoid all of this type of thing, so that when you deploy, well, the version that you built in the development environment is exactly the same version and the same thing, same piece of code when it goes to all the testing environments and eventually out to prod. There's huge benefits when it comes to parallel project paths. And specifically what I'm talking about is, how packages and scratch orgs and modular approach come in multiple, you can build packages into multiple branches. If you've been in the ISV world for any length of time, you have a single packaging org. But what you can't do there is build variations of your package. You'll find that most ISVs out there will enforce that clients stay on the latest and greatest release. And it's very difficult for them to support their multiple major releases of a product. And the reason is simply because of the constraint of the paradigm of first generation packages. But they can now, in second generation packages, work on branches. And those branches, they can build packages from any of those branches and explore different combinations that'll work. And so they experiment much faster. Another issue or another aspect of this is that, it allows you to release a test in isolation. And you can do it from various release branches. And so one scenario I always talk about is, you might have a release cadence of once a month. And you might be, we're in the middle of May 2020 right now. You might have a team that's working on the May features, and they get that development done, and then they take that development, all those changes, and they put a change set together, or they might use a tool like Apado, and they move all those changes up to the next test environment. And, well, they've got testers working on that test environment right now, so they're going to take their time and they're going to focus on the June features. So they're working in the same sandbox, and they're working on their June features. But the testers might come back and say, oops, there's a problem and we need this fixed. Well, if you've contaminated, and that's a way to think about it, if you've contaminated your development environment with the June changes, then you have to be extra specially careful. You've got to make sure that you fix the bug and deploy only that bug without deploying anything that's destined for the June release. But if you were able to get into various release branches and manage things through source control management, and really do your development in isolation into various scratch orgs, which are DX functionality, then you wouldn't have that overlap, and you would have multiple environments and enough environments to manage all the different work threads and release streams. You got to, there's unit testing benefits. When you're dealing with tests, again, if you can focus on a small module, it's much easier to focus and concentrate all of that information in the tests around that area. If you've got a very large, a large environment like I'm dealing with right now, the Department of Veteran Affairs, I have several different SIs out there. Each of them, they're very focused about their own particular application. And when one state that I'm striving for is to get them in an isolation so that their package represents the work that they've committed to the VA. And what I can do then is test their app, look for unit test code coverage, the really completeness of coverage, and I can do it in isolation, and I can grade the effort and the work from the SI and make it easier to deal with. Auditing benefits, there's lots of them out there, especially around things like if I deploy a unlock package or a second generation package, I know and I can tag the source code repository, and I know exactly what was in the source code is exactly what's in this package. And it's always the same everywhere. And then, you've got onboarding benefits. Think about, instead of this massively large org, if you had a new guy come along or a new team and they take over one module, it's much easier to focus on a smaller piece of work. So that's been a lot of things and a lot of concepts about the various types of benefits that you'll get. But let's talk about a serious adoption plan. Now, this adoption plan that I'm talking about, I have been using. This has been my recipe for pretty much 3 years now. And the major steps to it are pretty straightforward. Understanding and organizing your code base. And what I talk about is slicing your metadata vertically. I also propose pushing and organizing your code base sort of horizontally in layers. And we'll talk about the layers, but doing it by purpose. You got to focus and understand what your package dependency hierarchy is going to be looking like. One thing I always talk about is adopting very strict naming conventions. And we'll talk about why that. And then get used to making, effective usage of continuous integration process, because continuous integration process is going to help you keep your sanity during these large migrations. And then finally, it's all about managing metadata across distinct packages. And again, this gets into dependency injection. We'll talk a little bit about this a little bit soon enough. So when I'm talking about organizing your code base into vertical slices, what I'm really talking about is analyzing it so you understand how things are coming together and how you want, how you anticipate the package dependency will come together. And when you do that, you look for areas which potentially could be the packages. And so what you end up doing is you go to the upper left-hand side, the tic-tac-toe box, and look at all the Salesforce applications that you have in the screen. That's a good indicator of potential places that you can do. You look for the App Exchange customizations, and you look to any kind of open source frameworks that you have there. You look to specific third-party or maybe custom back office type services and integrations. All of these areas are potential areas where you could encapsulate them in a specific package. And then finally, generally always going to be some layer of a foundation type package or frameworks. And when you talk about that final foundation package, it's actually got nothing to do with the data layer, but it is all about frameworks and utils. And then finally, some area that you're going to look for is areas where you have common overlap. People talk about the 5 core S objects, the case account, user, contact, etc. And the reality is these are the 5 most utilized things in the Salesforce environment, and they never strictly belong to one application. And so it's good to figure out a way that you can encapsulate the basic functionality so that they can be utilized by multiple business applications. But as I said, that these become the sort of layers and preliminary idea of what your packages will look like. When you organize by purpose, you're dealing with the horizontal layers. And so really what you're looking to opportunities to separate your code into multiple layers and purposes. And so you might have the basic triggers and S objects, but other things you might look into are selectors. They're all about querying the S objects. Domains, they focus all of the business logic around a specific S object. Services, they're more of an aggregate layer over top of your domains. And controllers and extensions, and you've got batch Apex and scheduled Apex and various types of web service endpoints and all kinds of other things like platform events and invocables and email handlers. These are all the different things that are going on in your org. They might be Apex classes, they might be visual flows, but they can be easily quantified into one of these groups. And that's important because you want to be able to name and work with these items in just that type of modular fashion. And let's see. Understanding your package dependencies. So once you sort of get an idea of how to segment your org in vertical and horizontal slices, then you got to start taking a look at your package dependencies. And basically, it's going to be an exercise where you draw a map and lay out all the different applications that you've figured out from the previous steps. You've got to understand how those packages depend on each other. And you've got to include, say, dependencies on third-party managed packages. And typically when I do this exercise, I find that it organizes into 5 basic layers. And these 5 layers are the frameworks. These are the code that, the frameworks allow you to get into all the dependency injection and whatnot and build your application from. There's always some level of back office integration group of packages that come about. There are third-party extension packages, which of course depend on their third-party packages, the same name. And like I said, there's always some combination of common packages, because these common packages are objects and some basic code that's always going to be utilized by the last group, and that is the business layer group of applications. These are the distinct business units and whatnot. So typically it forms up this way. It'll be individual for each one of your own orgs, but this is a general guideline. I said strict naming conventions is very helpful to use, and here's why. Because it's very hard to stay organized when you're managing a transition. The transition to DX and packaging won't happen in a day. The transition, of an existing code base will take time, And one thing that I find usually helpful is figure out a package prefix to your name. So name your metadata with a prefix, maybe a code, maybe a small word that means eventually what the package it will belong to. And then give it a meaningful suffix. And a suffix describes the purpose. And so we were alluding to that previously about organizing your code by purpose. And then, the naming conventions, they apply both programmatically and to declarative logic. And you come up with various combinations like the common account selector and the marketing campaigns object. And these are various things that you can think. But basically the motto is, what you're looking for is you want the metadata named to tell you where they belong in which package eventually. And then lots of different benefits. And like I said, we've been talking about these a little bit. I said make effective use of continuous integration. Choose a tool that works for you, whatever that tool may be. And perfect the build process on the first group of packages, especially packages that don't have dependencies. Maybe your open source projects. But then you perfect that process more and more as you add more packages into it. There's two types of build jobs that you want to look at. First of all is the Salesforce CLI base, and they build each 2GP package. But then there's a final job that builds the larger remaining unpackaged Happy Soup code. And what that last job will do is it'll install all of the packages that are already ready, and then it'll take the remaining bit of the code base and put it in to make sure the whole thing is working. But CI is crucial for revealing, among other things, these circular dependencies that I was talking about earlier, because it'll become quickly apparent when you build these packages where you've forgotten to add pieces in, and you'll be able to identify these circular references and resolve them accordingly. Another aspect that you're going to get into when you're managing this across metadata packages is breaking out the logic across standard and custom objects, managing object field additions through dependency injection, inter-package communication, and finally, for those of you who are using the Financial Force Apex comment framework, the managing and dynamically defining the application factory. So let's talk about those a little bit. Specifically, you've got to identify when you're setting up the packages for things like account, you've got to identify the minimal number of fields that will be standard across all business applications. You've got to, identify the other fields that might be on these S objects and figure out which package really owns them, because those packages will add those fields. Third-party managed packages will definitely add lots of fields to, especially the account object. And there might be downstream packages or the business packages, as we saw in the previous slide. They will add more fields and more logic to this. And so you have to manage that accordingly. And you've got to think about it from the standpoint of that every package owns, an S object is only owned by a single package, and that becomes important in other things. We'll talk about that a little bit later. When you're talking about managing field additions across packages, you're going to use something like dependency injection to add the extra fields to, say, an account selector, which might be in a different package. You're dynamically bringing that to bear, bringing that and adjusting that query. And there are other talks that I've done that get into more of the weeds around how to make this happen. One thing that I do caution people with is avoid a universal base schema package. Stay focused that packages own only the core elements of what they need, core elements of an S object. Don't get into the trap of creating a base package with all the different S objects, because you'll end up with this monolithic beast. Some of the other concepts that I'll talk about, like selector field injection. Again, selectors are all about queries. And so how do you get the new fields that have been deployed by a business app to the account selector? Well, it's a selector field injection paradigm. And again, I talk about some of these more, these frameworks. I'll give you a link later to a talk that I did discussing the frameworks that I use to make all of this type of injection happen. But there's also things like selector method injection, bringing whole new logics and way of querying for objects that are really business specific, business package specific. And then getting into domain process. Domain process is all about what happens when there's a DML event, and how do you inject logic that's specific to a business unit. Now, if you have to communicate between packages, it's very, how do you make sure that you communicate between same level packages without creating a dependency one on the other? And so when you've got new logic that occurs and you want to trigger another process in another prior, the way you do it is through things like dependency injection-based platform event subscriptions. Again, I get into techniques in a different talk about how that happens. But when logic needs to occur asynchronously after the primary de-knowledge event, change data capture is exactly the way you want to do it. So we've had a lot of success on that front. Now, I said also, if you're into this Apex Common Framework, the application factory needs to be decoupled as well, and there are techniques to do that. And so basically what you end up doing with a framework called AT4DX, and again, I'll give you links about that, is that you dynamically add the processes and you dynamically add the selectors and domains and services. You dynamically add the functionality to this application factory by basically custom metadata type records that are injected. And they all utilize that same base application factory paradigm going forward. So let's talk a little bit about some things that you'll have to think about around the Dev Hub. When you're in especially a large environment, you're going to plan your Dev Hub, of course, in your production org. If you're in a multi-org scenario, find the org that's going to be the most accessible to your developers. And then you're going to manage the access through a series of permission sets. And again, you can read the finer points about each one, but you give these permission sets to the specific, by role. You give the Salesforce DX development to all the developers, and then the administration team has greater control. And then that final one is all about the access that your DX pipeline or continuous integration server will have. That you will adjust the permission set slightly if you're into the Scratch org snapshot pilot, and we can talk about that in a minute. But this is the basic way about how you set up the DX or the Dev Hub. The betas and the pilots to be mindful of, the org shape for Scratch org's pilot, and allows you to tailor in, get the Scratch org set up so that you can have specific limits and whatnot. The one that I really am excited about is the Scratch org snapshot, and basically it allows you to load those larger packages that you are depending on, especially with third-party integrations. So you want to look out for that. There's a new one that just announced last week, and that's the org-dependent unlock packages that should be coming out in beta in summer of 20. And again, that's a different way to deal with it as far as if you want to experiment with packages in a happy soup scenario. But when you look at this, you're going to have to plan and prepare for things to change. There will be changes to your development strategy. First of all, you developers will be operating out of Scratch orgs. And you will start to keep your package code bases very small and in lots of different source code repos. You're going to take advantage, like I said, you're going to take advantage of these new pilots when they features when they come available. And you're going to have an easier time to focus on each package, and you're going to independently keep those code coverage levels up higher. When you do this, you're going to have to plan to provision test data. And what I mean here is that when developers are working in a Scratch org, they need a way to systematically set up the data, the base data for those use cases in that org. And like I said, with taking advantage of frameworks like Apex Mocking and some dependency injection, you're going to want to plan for various strategies along this front as well. And finally, you're going to find that you're going to keep related test logic. It may be for Selenium scripts. It may be Eggplant. I'm a big fan of Eggplant of late. And you're going to want to keep all of those relevant tests with the source code for that package and for that module. And so those are going to be some of the changes you'll see at a development level. Declarative development will change. First of all, let's level set on this basic idea. Process builders and flows are programming languages. They're just different from Apex. And they definitely can be developed in Scratch orgs and in the DX paradigm. I have done it. I've trained teams to get there. I know it can happen. Declarative developers are going to have to learn a couple of new things. And that's just the accepted fact. And, what they need to learn, just look to Trailhead for those types of things that they're going to do. But you're going to think about your flows in a different way. You might define one flow in an upstream package that might do a basic function, and then you might call that flow from a business-specific package. And so you're going to have to look for opportunities like that to make your flows modular. And you'll learn about the flexibility. I would highly suggest checking out the ForceDI open source framework, because Doug Ayers, who works for Salesforce, made an awesome addition that allows actual dependency injection for flows. And so again, I'll give you the links to that in a little bit. But remember, declarative development was new to everybody at one time. And so if you can learn all the complexities of that, I promise you can learn to do all that work in a DX paradigm. Your DevOps strategy is definitely going to change. Again, I said focus on automated CIs. Take a package-centric approach. Don't think about your org as a whole unit, but think about it as various packages. Make your CI process repeatable and scalable. Look to finding ways in the automated CI thing to build global build scripts to reduce the build script changes that you might have across all of the different projects. Utilize the DX scratch orgs and work on, you'll find that your testing becomes far less burdensome, and you'll find out ways to, you need to find out ways in your automated CI process to test impacts to downstream packages. So you might have a change upstream, and you've got to find a way to make sure that is not breaking things downstream. And again, we talked about the packaging unit test per package. You'll find that your sandbox strategy will change quite a bit. The need for development sandboxes will be less because they'll be in scratch orgs. A few development sandboxes will stay around because things like profiles and layouts really do not work well in 2GPs. The number of testing sandboxes actually might increase, because then you'll be able to get into testing in various branched builds or maybe different release trains. Maybe again, that analogy of testing the May release versus testing the June release. But definitely your release management burden will go down, because you'll start to move code around as 2GPs, as packages. And it'll be far simpler to move a package from point A to point B to point C to production than it is to try to combine everything and do a change set or just an unpackaged deployment. It's important when you take this exercise to crystallize what your definition of done is. All too often people get excited and they're like, well, I'm going to go to DX. What does that mean? I'm going to move everything. I'm going to move everything to a package. I want to take my entire org and move it to a single package. Well, that's really not buying you any benefit there. So it's very important to take some time and really think about what the definition of done is. And this adoption process will expose some technical debt, so plan on it. It's important to understand, among the things, the cost of this migration exercise. You've got to think about it from various things. What is your current situation like? I work to identify ways to understand what the cost is of living in the current situation. Look at your available resources. Do you have the bandwidth to take on this extra effort? And if not, you're going to need to staff up. There's definitely some books out there that I highly recommend. One of them is Accelerate. It talks about DevOps in a technology agnostic way. But then there's another one called Mastering Salesforce DevOps by Andrew Davis. And that takes the principles of Accelerate and focuses them in the world of Salesforce DX, or Salesforce, in fact. But, it provides interesting insights about how to qualify the cost and understanding the cost of migration. So, forgive me, I've been running through this very fast, and I know I've been hitting a lot of different things. First of all, I mentioned that there are some frameworks out there. They're managed by a group called the Apex Enterprise Pattern open source group. You can find us on GitHub. And basically, it's these 4 frameworks. And you go into those frameworks, there's a lot of documentation, a lot of videos, a lot of talks been done over the years for this type of thing. I mentioned that I've been doing previous talks, and so those previous talks about where you can get more information are basically in these 2 areas. First of all, it was a talk at Trailhead DX 18. It was called Architecting Unlocked Packages in Your Salesforce Org. So this was the journey and the thought process that I had when going through the migration at the Morgan & Morgan law firm. The second one, Advanced Techniques to Adopt DX, or Salesforce DX Unlocked Packages. That's all about the frameworks and how to apply them. And it's myself and a good friend of mine named John Story gave that talk. And again, both of them are available on YouTube. I highly encourage you to check them out. I always make various recommendations for things to be reading, because in my opinion, these 3 books right here they should be on every serious developer and application architect's book list. These provide huge insights into how to properly organize your code. And so again, I'm making a plug for these. Please go get these books if you haven't already read them. They were invaluable and changed my career tremendously by doing it. In summary, we've talked a lot about, the unhappy soups out there and the issues around that. We talked about a general plan to adopt DX and packaging. And again, you're going to have to refine it. It's a skeleton plan. And we plan for the change. You stress the needs that you're going to have to plan for this change and refactoring. And really, it's all about managing the expectations of everybody involved, everybody from the developers all the way to the business execs who are stroking the checks. So one thing I tell everybody is it is going to be a big journey, but it will be one that is worth it. So with that, I'm done. If you're participating in the treasure hunt, here's the code for this particular talk. And I guess let's open it up to questions. What do you got?
Yeah, John. So we are at 5:40. That's the end of the session, but we can probably take some questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So first question is, where do you start? It's too easy. Do you start with a grouping of all your utility classes in a package, then identify packages that are good candidates for the next package, starting from zero?
It depends on the complexity of your org and the life of your org. I know the first time I did it, before I moved to really even DX and packaging, me and my team spent almost a year refactoring our code base to be, with the principles of the vertical and the horizontal slices, instituting proper layering of the code base. And so again, it depends. I mean, right now, one of the big ways that we're looking at is I'm trying to find code where existing applications have already been created and they're pretty isolated and they can be taken out of the code base and deployed to a new app. That's a great candidate for something like a Scratch or a pilot. And if you can get it completely separated from any other metadata dependencies, that might be a good candidate for a packaging pilot. So again, it's a huge depends question.
Okay. Next one, when all components which are available in current metadata API will be available in the unlock packages?
You will have to, I don't know that answer. I don't work for Salesforce. It has been, they've been closing the gap on the elements of metadata that are not available in the unlock package. There are still some outlier, and that Salesforce is going to be the one to do it. I know there's a report that's available. Forgive me, I don't remember where it is, but if you go to the Salesforce, if you go find a success community group called Unlock Packages, in that group has been talked about the metadata report and where it's going. And if not, you can ask in that group and make it happen.
Okay. John, we'll take one last question. I have a managed package published using a previous way. Can I move to GP?
So the question is around, you've got ISVs, they've been doing first generation packaging, and can they start taking advantage of it? The DX and second generation packaging now. Yes and no. If you wanted to start new development on new packages and mainly package extensions, then yes, you can take advantage of second generation managed packages, which is one of those types, and you can do it pretty easily right now. If you're going to deploy it via the App Exchange, most likely you're going to be in a new namespace. And so that might be something you factor. If you're looking to take your existing first generation package and treat it as a second generation package, you're going to have to wait a little bit longer. Last time I spoke with the packaging team, is they're hoping to go into pilot. I want to say, really safe harbor here, winter 21 release maybe, or spring 21 release, when they'll be starting ready to transition. In the partner community, the partner success community, there's a group called think it's Salesforce DX managed packages or just managed packages. Go find that group, get into that group, and that's where the announcements are coming about transitioning first generation packages to second generation packages.
Okay, John, I think that's all the time we have. We have a lot of questions on the Q&A as well.
Yeah.
So just a reminder, all the slides and the videos will be hosted in a YouTube channel, and the links will be sent out. And John, thanks a lot for your time. It was a great presentation, a lot of good content, and thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
All right, so hope to see you in the next session,
Absolutely.
audience. Thanks so much.